Well, welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 274. This time I'm going to talk about this release, which was the second full LP release by Desmond Dekker, the groundbreaking ska and rocksteady and eventually reggae artist, from 1969 called The Israelites. It was originally released on Pyramid in the UK. This is a 2016 re-release by Trojan slash Pyramid. Anyway, the key information is that it's mastered from the original analog tapes and it sounds pretty good. Desmond Dekker is one of the most significant musical figures in Jamaica, particularly in the 1960s. He was one of the first musicians from the rocksteady and reggae scenes to achieve anything resembling international fame. On this record, the title cut was a massive worldwide hit, and of course it takes center stage, but there's lots of other great music here as well. In terms of musical style, it's primarily rocksteady, which is a slightly more upbeat, immediate predecessor of reggae. It's super infectious all the way through, and it's a wonderful window into late 60s Jamaican musical culture. Desmond Dekker is actually born Desmond Dekkers in the outskirts of Kingston in July 1941. He's orphaned in his teens and he grows up outside Kingston on a farm in St. Thomas Parish near a place called Seaforth. When he finished high school, he returned to Kingston and initially got a job as a welder. In the late 50s and early 60s, the domestic music scene in Jamaica was basically comprised of a bunch of folks who had started off as sound system operators in the 1950s, who then had moved to start up their own record businesses and their own record studios. And those included people like Duke Reid at Treasure Isle Records and Cox and Dodd at Studio One. And it was to those places that Desmond Dekker went to try and audition and get a record deal. Well, he gets turned down by Reid and he gets turned down by Cox and Dodd, but he has some success with Leslie Kong at Beverly's Records. He initially auditioned at Beverly's for the label's big star at the time, a guy called Derek Morgan, who said to Leslie Kong, "This guy is great." But Kong wasn't so sure. He brought him under his wing and began collaborating with him, but he wouldn't record Dekker for a couple of years. Leslie Kong himself is kind of an interesting guy. It's not that well known a fact outside Jamaica that one of the real fathers of reggae music was actually a Chinese Jamaican who originally was running an ice cream parlor and a record store with his brothers. One day in 1961, he comes into the record store, and outside the store is a guy called Jimmy Cliff, who's singing a song he's written called Dearest Beverly, which is a blatant attempt to try and get Leslie Kong to find a way to put Jimmy Cliff on record. So he takes this as a sign, and he creates a studio, and Jimmy Cliff is one of the very first artists that he records. In fact, Cliff would stay with Leslie Kong all the way through his career until Kong dies in 1971. Getting back to Desmond Dekker, who had auditioned a little bit after all this happens and had been told to cool his jets, Dekker then recommended a co-worker of his at the welding shop, a guy by the name of Bob Marley, who gets his first paid recording gig with Leslie Kong and puts out a couple of tracks, including his debut, Judge Not. In 1963, Dekker, who's been mentored by Kong in terms of songwriting, is finally ready to step into the studio, and he makes a track called Honor Thy Father and Mother, which goes right to #1 in Jamaica. But despite that achievement, the record that really makes his reputation in Jamaica and turns him into a bit of a cultural icon is one of the next tracks he releases, called King of Ska. On that record, he's not singing solo, he's backed up by a vocal group called the Cherry Pies, who would soon go on to become much more famous under the name Toots and the Maytals. That track and the slickness associated with having a backing group turns Dekker into a bit of a big deal in Jamaica, so he hires his own backing group, taking advantage of the blood harmonies of four brothers, Carl, Patrick, Barry, and Clive Howard. Backed up by the Howard brothers, who were dubbed the Four Aces, Dekker then releases a whole slew of chart-topping ska hits. It's also a case of being in the right place at the right time, because Jamaica in the mid-1960s was going through a huge period of cultural ferment. Independence had been achieved in 1962, bringing with it a wave of optimism. You had the cultural influence of Rastafari, which was coming to challenge the place of Western religion in Jamaican society. And the backdrop to all this, of course, is a rapidly changing set of musical styles, from the mixture of calypso and Jamaican variant mento and US R&B in the 1950s, on to ska and rocksteady, and then eventually reggae into the late 60s and early 70s. There's also a lot of social change going on, some of it positive, not all of it positive. And so you get the rise towards the later part of the 60s of gangs and the so-called rude boy phenomenon. A lot of these changes end up getting reflected in the music, and just like hip-hop decades later, musicians turned this social ferment and upheaval into musical gold. Dekker himself ends up at the forefront of all this. His image up until 66, 67 had been that of kind of a nice boy you take home to mother, maybe even a bit uptight, because a lot of his early lyrics are all sort of like finger-wagging things regarding loose women. But then what happens is he backs up his label mate Derek Morgan on a track called Tougher Than Tough, which became basically a chart-topping rude boy standard, and took Morgan into a whole kind of diss battle with a guy called Prince Buster. A lot of kind of cultural moral panic associated to that. Dekker manages to avoid this. What he sees, however, and what Kong sees, is the commercial potential in Rude Boy tracks, and so they begin to put a bunch of these out. And right away, Dekker tastes some great success of his own with this track called 007 Shantytown, which is not only a chart topper in Jamaica, but does really well in the UK. Not just the Jamaican immigrants, not just the mods, but also this whole nascent culture called skinheads. Well before association with punks, well before the association with white supremacists, this was a late 60s working class movement in Britain, but they loved and dug the ska and rocksteady records that were coming out of Jamaica. Because he was doing well in the UK, there was also pressure to put out an LP because while singles were big in Jamaica, LPs had become the thing, thanks to the Beatles and others in Britain. So Kong works with a guy called Graham Goodall, who along with Kong had been one of the original co-founders of Island Records along with Chris Blackwell. And he sets up a label in collaboration with Kong called Dr. Bird Records. The Dr. Bird is the national bird of Jamaica, I discovered. And the whole point of that was basically to be the distribution arm of Beverly's Records in the UK. Goodall puts out this first LP called 007 Shantytown after the big hit, and he also sets up Pyramid Records as a successor, which ends up being the label that puts out this album. As I mentioned, Dekker was basically a singles artist, and this record, like its predecessor LP, is basically a compilation of recent singles that had done well in Jamaican charts. All the tracks were produced by Leslie Kong, who co-wrote 6 of them. On vocals you have Dekker, you also have the Aces, but in various configurations. The story behind the title track is that Dekker is in a park and he hears a couple arguing. The wife is saying, "You're not bringing home enough money." The husband's saying, "I'm working hard, but they don't pay me enough." Dekker takes these ideas just right then and there, thinks how universal they are, and by the time he's walked home, he's basically written the whole track. The title, which seems a little incongruous, is actually a Rasta reference to the 12 tribes of Israel from the Hebrew Bible. It goes to number 1 in the UK and number 9 on the Billboard charts in the US. Depending on how you count, it's the first genuinely Jamaican song to really crack the US market. Honorable mention to the Banana Boat song by Harry Belafonte, but by the time that was recorded, he was already living in the States and it was recorded in the US. Following all this success, Kong and Dekker decide that it would make good sense for Dekker to leave Jamaica, move to the UK, make that his base. So off he goes. He leaves the Aces behind in Jamaica. Initially, all this works out just fine. He has a top 10 hit in the UK with his cover of Jimmy Cliff's song, "You Can Get It If You Really Want." But then disaster strikes. Leslie Kong, his producer, his mentor, and basically his songwriting partner, dies of a heart attack in 1971 at the age of 37. This was a terrible blow for Dekker to absorb. It was also a terrible blow for Jimmy Cliff to absorb. Just like Dekker, he'd been with Kong through his whole career. For much of the rest of the 70s, Dekker wasn't able to make much headway. He did enjoy a real career revival in the late 70s and early 80s with the whole two-tone movement and the beat and the specials and the selector. But for the most part, Dekker's contribution is really within those golden years of 1963 to 1971. Side 1 starts with the title track, The Israelites. For me, my very favorite part is actually the backup singing. It's Not Easy is mostly sung in falsetto. It's got a great sax solo in the bridge. The next track, Intensified, is a total banger, and funnily enough, it's actually a bit of a novelty track in origin because it was a play on a marketing campaign for Intensified Tide, which was a laundry soap, which I guess had a lot of market share in Jamaica at the time. Tip of My Fingers is another great track, which is actually, if anything, as much an early 60s doo-wop tune as anything else, or even maybe a country tune. The last track on side 1, Too Much Too Soon, is an example of how Dekker's all-world voice could take even the most standard rocksteady backing track up several levels. Not that it's generic music. This is a really, really tight house band. It's basically the Beverly All-Stars. Side 2 starts with another huge hit for Dekker called It Mek. Nincompoop is next, and this is a great rocksteady sort of doo-wopish number. Problems is another real rocksteady banger, just a wall of bass and some incredible interplay between Dekker and the Aces. For Once in My Life is one of the rare covers on here, and the record concludes with Rude Boy Train, which is top shelf rocksteady and is, if anything, kind of a Rude Boy version of People Get Ready. While Desmond Dekker is basically a singles artist, this LP, along with its predecessor, 007 Shantytown, 2 original LPs released, which are basically, I would consider to be essential parts of any reggae collection. If you're getting into exploring Jamaican music and you're going beyond mid-70s roots reggae and you're going beyond Bob Marley and Peter Tosh, this is a great place to start. It's a great window into that late 60s, early 70s rocksteady to reggae moment. It's full of hits with barely any of the filler you get with singles collections. It's a very fun record, and for me, it's 4 out of 5 stars.